Then, everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
As someone living in a former British colony, now an independent republic, I've been wanting to discuss colonialism. Countless libraries have been filled with texts on colonialism, and there's no way I could cover it all. But today I'll be drawing from Memmi, a French-Tunisian writer who tackled the psychological effects of colonialism. I'll also be pulling from Sekeres, the Martinican poet who wrote Discourse on Colonialism. And I'll also draw from Frantz Fanon, a Martinican psychiatrist and political philosopher. But before we can understand the impact of colonization on the psyche of both its subjects, the colonizer and the colonized, we need to understand the vast nature of colonialism. It can be difficult to grapple with the gravity of colonialism's impact. Those centuries of domination have irreversibly transformed our planet and all its inhabitants. Our present national borders and demographics have been largely shaped and dictated by the colonization and conquest of a few nations from Europe. Colonialism, put simply by anthropologist Kortright, is the establishment and control of a territory for an extended period of time by a sovereign power over a subordinate and other people, which is segregated and separated from the ruling power. He goes on. Features of the colonial situation include political and legal domination over the other society, relations of economic and political dependence, and institutionalized racial and cultural inequalities, to impose their dominant physical force through raids, expropriation of labor and resources, imprisonment, and objective murders. Enslavement of both the indigenous people and their land is the primary objective of colonization. Native cultures must be destroyed, stripped, crushed, emptied, subsumed, co-opted, and dismantled. Since colonialism relies on a superiority-inferiority dichotomy, the colonialists must impose their own culture over the native population, from language to dress to daily practice. The native culture, once uplifting, fluid, and living, becomes the very stain that marks the indigenous peoples as inferior. Even though the old form of colonization is largely over, it still lingers as a specter in the sphere of culture, politics, and economics. Despite Europeans' claim to bring civilization to the world, Europe truly destroyed the existing complex cultures and civilizations in their so-called civilizing efforts. The colonial complex created the world we see today, and left quite the impression in both the colonized and the colonizer. So how does colonialism impact our identity? In comes Memmi. Memmi splits the psychological conditions of the colonizer and the colonized into four parts. The colonizer who accepts, who are called Christopher, the colonizer who refuses, who are called John, the colonized who accepts, who are called Candace, and the colonized who refuses, who are called Nat. The colonizer who accepts. When Christopher the colonizer accepts his role, he becomes a colonialist. But it means he has to accept the fact that his position of privilege is non-legitimate. He usurped it by force. So the only way he can really enjoy his position would be to absolve himself of the guilt of the conditions under which it was attained. That's why Christopher falsifies history, creates racist mythology, rewrites laws, and attempts to whitewash his legacy. That's why he emphasizes his superiority while casting aspersions on the colonized. He has to do whatever it takes to justify his evils, to uplift himself to the skies while grinding those below him to the ground. Deep down, Christopher knows all this is messed up, but he can't admit that himself. He has to keep degrading the colonized. And so, just as the colonial situation manufactures the colonized, Christopher the colonialist is also transformed. Now he cheers on torture, discrimination, and massacre. He becomes a reactionary, a conservative, and a fascist. But the condemnation that he carries in his heart can never truly be erased. It pisses him off that he relies on the colonized to maintain the colony, even though he came looking for profit and already has a homeland. But he has to direct his anger somewhere, so he becomes a racist. And not just any racism, a racism so fundamentally ingrained in his personality. His racism is built on three major components. 1, that there exists a major gulf between him and the colonized. 2, that he can exploit these differences to his benefit. And 3, that these differences are absolute and cannot be changed. Therefore, he's able to remain separate from the community of the colonized by halting any social mobility, and he's able to continue to justify his superiority. Added bonus, he gets to feel good about himself while doing it. He becomes a humanitarian. Surely, the colonized needed him to bring the light of civilization. I mean, look at them, so stupid and servile. All of this is natural and eternal, so he has nothing to worry about. If he enjoys a couple perks in his quest to civilize them, well, surely it's just justice. The colonized should be grateful. Christopher. benevolent master of the natural order. Don't question it. Aimé Césaire was right to say that colonization dehumanizes even the most civilized man. It inevitably tends to change him who undertakes it. That the colonizer, who in order to ease his conscience gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends objectively to transform himself into an animal. The Colonizer Who Refuses. Not every colonizer becomes a colonialist. John tries to resist the role, but he's still a colonizer. He tries to ignore his position of privilege, but he cannot escape mentally from a concrete situation. He cannot refuse the ideology of colonialism while continuing to live with its actual relationships, while continuing to benefit from the privileges he half-heartedly denounces. See, colonial relations can't be boiled down to individual feelings. So it doesn't matter much materially if John accepts or rejects it. It doesn't matter if he feels guilty or not. His identity is fundamentally tied in relation to colonization. He's still part of the oppressing group. He shares in their good fortune and will likely share their fate. Aimé Césaire makes it clear that the truth is, between the colonizer and the colonized, there is room only for forced labor, intimidation, pressure, the police, taxation, theft, rape, compulsory crops, contempt, mistrust, arrogance, self-complacency, swinishness, brainless elites, degraded masses. No human contact, but relations of domination and submission, which turn the colonizing man into a classroom monitor, an army sergeant, a prison guard, a slave driver, and the indigenous man into an instrument of production. Even if John's a leftist, trying his best to assist the national liberation of the colonized peoples, he's still in a rough situation. Of course, not many colonizers have actually been bouted like that, but let's pretend they are. Even if John wants to create a world without colonization, it may still be hard for him to picture his situation changing much. He's accustomed to privilege. Equality is probably gonna feel like oppression. He can't imagine not being who he is, with the comfortable domination of his culture and language. He's never had to accommodate others before. He may still hold to the subtle vestiges of the racist ideology that his country was built on. He will have to fight his own class interests and his own fellow colonizers. And if he wants revolution, John will have to recognize that such a revolution will require the death of his present identity and the rebirth of another. Not many people are willing to take on such a gargantuan task. Césaire called colonization thingification. So let us turn our attention to those things. Let's discuss the situation of the colonized, in this case Candace and Nat, largely defined by the images and myths that surround them and tell them who they are. The Colonized Who Accepts. The colonized have no way out of their condition within the colonial order. They're not free to choose between being colonized and not being colonized. They just are. Candace understands this. Her whole life, she's had to grapple with the negative portraits of herself that were created by the colonizer, like the lazy coon stereotype. Like all the images used to support the colonial situation, it raises the colonizer and humbles the colonized. It becomes a beautiful justification for the colonizer's privilege. It paints the colonized as inert and the colonizer as active. It implies that the employment of the colonized is not very profitable, therefore justifying the unbearable or non-existent wages paid to them. Candace thinks to herself, perhaps the colonizer is right. Perhaps we are lazy. Perhaps we are stupid. Perhaps we are timid and weak. The degrading portrait ends up being accepted, and is usually one of the final steps of colonization, the colonization of the mind. Once the colonized begins to tolerate rather than resist colonization, all they can really look to do is attempt to assimilate, which is impossible by design. That doesn't mean Candace won't try. She sheds the memories of her ancestors and the practices and institutions of her culture. She embraces the colonizer's world and all of its institutions as right and just, the colonizer's salve and the colonizer's whip, and most importantly, the colonizer's school. She attends and then sends her children to attend the schools built by the colonizer to erase and replace her people's history, traditions, and most importantly, language. She and her kin are imbued with double consciousness, and she's trapped in this sunken place, performing for the colonizer in a home country that now feels foreign. She's surrounded by the language of the colonizer. Their street signs, documents, courts, governmental bureaucracy, and industry all use the colonizing language. Meanwhile, her mother language, the one used at home, the one used tenderly by her ancestors, the one that sustains her innermost feelings, emotions, and dreams, is devalued and degraded. All she can do now is shed it. Candace loses far more than she gains: her history, her culture, her future. She rejects herself, self-love, and liberation itself, attempting to model herself after the colonizer, or rather, crush herself into conformity. She gains self-hate, shame, and alienation. She sees her own people through the eyes, through the condemnations and accusations of the colonizer. She is alone, estranged from her people and rejected by the colonizer, utterly defeated. The Colonized Who Refuses. Like Candace, Nat knows that they will never be emancipated within the colonial relationship. But unlike Candace, they know that there is no liberty in assimilation. Revolt is the only way out. An absolute condition requires an absolute solution, and there can be no compromise. Their liberation is a process of self-recovery and autonomous dignity. They must shake off the false images and boldly attack the institutions of oppression. But even in their resistance, Nat still bears the traces of colonization. They still share some values, techniques, and methods with the colonizer. They still speak the language the colonizer can understand. To be truly emancipated, Nat must embrace their mother tongue and work to rebuild the authentic nature and unity of their people. Nat must reclaim and transform what the colonizers considered negative, must take pride in their wrinkles and wounds, never shying away from their colonization. Nat must accept themselves as they are. And they will likely continue to define themselves in relation to protest, in relation to revolt, and in relation to colonization. For they know that they are not an animal, and it is precisely at the moment they realize their humanity that they begin to sharpen the weapons with which they will secure their victory. I hope you enjoyed this dive into the minds of the colonizers and the colonized. Please understand that the fight is not over. We still grapple with the psychological, political, and economic consequences of colonization to this day. The mentalities and conditions I discuss still exist to varying extents today. We need to understand colonization's impact on us so that we can deconstruct the Leviathan and create a freer, more diverse, and more humane world. We cannot return to the past. We cannot prolong the present. We must create anew. We can forge true sovereignty, independence, freedom, and abundance. We can rebirth cultures, knowledges, values, and lifestyles. We can reclaim stolen lands and build new relations. We ourselves can be reborn. As we study and learn and expand our understanding of our histories and cultures, we can find a way out of the stratification and poverty, both psychological and economical, that we face today. Peace. Thank you for watching. Thanks once again to the family, Ongrad, Kobe Tamayo, John Vecchi, Orishimoni, and Swamkado Jones. You can join these beautiful humans and support me too on patreon.com/stayingtrue. Or you can give me a one-time donation on ko-fi.com/stayingtrue. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share with your fellow peoples. Feed the algorithm. Check out my previous videos for other fascinating topics. You can follow me on Twitter @_stayingtrue. Thanks again. Peace.